Right now, inside your body, there are about 3 billion letters of genetic code. They determine your eye color, your height, how your body fights disease, and 1,000 other things you never think about. But hidden inside that code is something else. A scar. A wound so old that it predates writing, predates cities, predates almost everything we call civilization. And that scar tells the story of something that happened roughly 7,000 years ago. Something so brutal, so widespread, and so devastating that it permanently altered the genetic makeup of every human being alive today. Here is what the scar says. In a relatively short period of time, maybe a few centuries, maybe less, the effective male population of Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa collapsed. Not by 10%, not by 30%, by 95%. Let me say that another way. For every 20 men who were alive before this event, only one survived to pass on his genes. Women outnumbered men 17 to 1. No war in recorded history comes even close to this level of destruction. Not World War I, not World War II. Nothing. And the most disturbing part? We did it to ourselves. The story of how we discovered this begins not in a battlefield or a mass grave, but in a genetics laboratory. A team of researchers was analysing the Y-Chromosome in modern human populations. The Y-Chromosome is unique because it passes exclusively from father to son, generation after generation, almost unchanged except for tiny mutations that act like a genetic clock. By studying the diversity of Y-chromosomes in living men, scientists can trace male lineages back thousands of years and estimate how many men were alive at any given point. What they found made them stop and check their equipment. At a point roughly 7,000 years ago, during the late Neolithic period, Y-chromosome diversity fell off a cliff. It was as if almost every male lineage on the planet had been erased in a single stroke. Now, bottlenecks happen. A volcanic eruption, a famine, a plague, these things kill indiscriminately. Men, women, children. If Mother Nature was responsible, you would expect the same drop in mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down through mothers. But the mitochondrial DNA showed no matching collapse. Women survived. Children survived. It was specifically and exclusively men who vanished. And here's the thing nobody tells you about genetics. When the data points to a massive die-off that targets only one half of the species, the explanation is almost never a natural disaster. The explanation is other humans. Once you know to look for it, the evidence is everywhere, and I mean literally everywhere. Archaeologists have identified more than 250 Neolithic mass killing sites in Europe alone. These are not ancient battlefields where two armies met in a fair fight. These are settlements where entire communities were erased. Take the Talheim death pit in Germany, dated to around 5000 BC. 34 bodies were unearthed there, men, women, and children, who had been killed in a single violent event. But here is what makes it chilling. None of the skeletons showed defensive wounds, no broken forearms from blocking blows, no hands cut from trying to grab a weapon. These people were not fighting, they were running. The killing blows came from 3 directions. The sharp side of an adze, a tool like a small axe, the blunt side of the same adze, and arrows. Most of the blows landed on the head. Even for victims who already had fatal wounds elsewhere, the killers made sure to crack the skull. 16 of the dead were children, 9 were adult men, 7 were older women. And here is the detail that repeats across site after site. Younger women were noticeably absent from the pit. They were taken. Not far away, in Austria, the massacre of Schlitz was even larger. 200 victims, dumped carelessly into a mass grave after a raid on a fortified settlement. Many of the dead were found without their arms and legs. Severed skulls were located separately from their bodies. Evidence of torture, evidence of dismemberment, evidence of rituals we can barely imagine. And once again, young women and teenage girls were missing from the dead. And then there is Herxheim. Herxheim, in modern Germany, was occupied between 5300 and 4950 BC. And what archaeologists found there is the largest known prehistoric mass grave in the world. More than 1,000 victims, possibly as many as 1,500. Their remains were deposited in at least 80 pits, right outside a settlement that, by Neolithic standards, was large, maybe 15 acres. But the number of people living there was almost certainly less than 50. Let that sink in. A village of fewer than 50 people was responsible for the deaths of more than 1,000. Nearly every body was processed the same way. Bones were broken open for marrow. Skulls were cleaved down the middle, possibly to access the brain, which would have been prized for its fatty content. Tongues were removed. Many of the bones showed signs of cooking. Some even showed evidence of having been spit roasted. And certain bones were missing more often than others. The hand bones. The foot bones. The parts that, if you were a group that had developed preferences, you might consider the best parts to eat. The people of Herxheim appear to have been skull cultists. They defleshed heads, kept them as trophies, and used them in rituals. Bones were carved into cups, tools, and decorations. Some skulls were mounted on spikes and placed at the entrance to the settlement, a warning to anyone who approached. The victims were not locals. Isotope analysis shows they came from vastly different cultures. Some were hunter-gatherers from the mountains. Others were farmers from the lowlands. Some travelled from as far as 500 kilometres away, captured in raids that required planning, coordination, and logistics from a group that probably numbered fewer than 50 people. So what did this violence actually look like on the ground? The weapons were simple and ubiquitous. Adzes and axes, spears and bows, clubs and knives, sickles and hoes, hammers. Any tool that could chop wood or harvest grain could also split a human skull. And they did. Constantly. There was no standard armour, no bronze chestplates or iron helmets. Fighters wore animal skins, woven cloth, plant material. Nothing that would stop an arrow or turn a blade. The result was a world where simply growing up was an accomplishment. Life expectancy during this period was somewhere between 20 and 33 years old. And that is not just because of infant mortality dragging down the average. Even if you made it to 15, you still would not expect to see 34. One analysis of more than 2,300 early farmers found that over 10% of men and women displayed injuries from weapons. Another study of 138 individuals in Spain found that 23% showed signs of aggressive damage. Adult and adolescent males were hit the hardest, making up 97% of those with unhealed injuries and 81% of those with healed trauma. In other words, if you were a man, experiencing more than one violent encounter in your lifetime was not just possible, it was normal. And researchers point out that only about 15% of fatal melee attacks with sharp weapons actually leave marks on bone. Most deaths left no archaeological trace at all. The 250 massacre sites we have found are almost certainly a tiny fraction of what actually happened. So what happened? Why did the world suddenly become a slaughterhouse? The answer begins with something that sounds, on the surface, like the best thing that ever happened to humanity: the Neolithic revolution. Around 10,000 years ago, humans began to figure out farming. Instead of following herds and foraging for food, they planted crops, they domesticated animals, they built permanent settlements. Populations grew, food surpluses accumulated, and for the first time in history, human beings had stuff worth stealing. That is the dark side of the agricultural revolution that nobody talks about. A hunter-gatherer band has almost nothing worth raiding. They carry what they own on their backs. If you attack them, the most you can gain is their lives, which have no value unless you are a cannibal. But a farming village is different. A farming village has grain stores, livestock, tools, and women. Settlements also made humans easier to find. You knew exactly where the grain was. You knew exactly when the harvest came in. You knew exactly how many men you needed to bring to overwhelm the defenders. Settlements were targets, and the people inside them knew it. Almost every Neolithic settlement we have found was fortified. Palisades, ditches, walls. They were not building defences against wild animals. They were building defences against each other. But here is the part people forget. The agricultural revolution also changed how families were structured. As resources became concentrated, trust became a rare commodity. It was easier to rely on people you were related to, specifically male relatives. Societies organised into patrilineal kin groups. Men stayed in the community they were born into. Women moved between communities through marriage. This created a world where every village was a clan of related males, and every outsider was a potential threat. And because the Y-chromosome stays with the men, father to son, generation after generation, when one patrilineal clan wiped out another, an entire male lineage disappeared from the genetic record forever. Multiply that across thousands of clans over hundreds of years, and you get the bottleneck. You get one man surviving for every 20 who did not. Now you might think this was a local event. One region, one culture, one exceptionally violent chapter in one corner of the world. It was not. The Y-chromosome bottleneck appears simultaneously across Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Different cultures with different weapons, different rituals, different languages, all engaged in the same pattern of violence at the same time. Patrilineal clans annihilating each other. Mass graves filling up outside fortified settlements. Young women taken as trophies. Young men dying before they could pass on their genes. This was, in some ways, the first global conflict humanity ever experienced. Not because anyone planned it that way, not because empires clashed or armies marched across continents, but because the same conditions, farming, settlements, surplus, patrilineal clans, produced the same results everywhere they appeared. Violence became not an exception, but an environment. something you lived inside, something you could not escape. The weapons varied by region. In Europe, it was adzes and clubs. In Asia, headhunting was particularly common, taking skulls as trophies and status symbols. Some groups systematically broke and removed shin bones. Others buried their victims alive. The methods were different. The motive was the same. Eliminate the competition. Take what they had. Survive. And for roughly 2,000 years, that is what the world looked like. So how did this end? How did humanity climb out of a world where 1 in 20 men survived and the dead were cooked and eaten by their neighbours? The honest answer is that it did not end. Not completely. Violence continued. Wars got bigger. From a pure numbers perspective, more people died in the centuries that followed than died during the Neolithic bottleneck. Technology made killing more efficient. Empires made armies larger. The 20th century alone produced conflicts that killed tens of millions. But here is the difference. After the bottleneck, the human population grew faster than we killed each other. Not because we became less violent, because we became more organized. Complex societies emerged with systems that discouraged constant raiding. Trade meant that taking your neighbor's grain by force was less profitable than buying it. Diplomacy meant that villages could negotiate instead of annihilate. Laws meant that disputes could be settled without mass graves. And very slowly, over thousands of years, the world became less deadly. It is only in the last 100 years that the number of conflicts starting each year has been on a mostly downward spiral. Since World War I, war between major powers has become rarer. Lifespans have tripled since the Neolithic. The idea that a neighbouring village might show up to kill you, take your wife, and mount your skull on a spike is no longer something you have to factor into your daily planning. 7,000 years ago, something happened that left a scar inside every one of us. The effective male population of the inhabited world collapsed by 95%. Women outnumbered men 17 to 1. For every 20 male lineages that existed before, only one survived. It was not a volcano. It was not a plague. It was us. The Neolithic Revolution gave us farming, settlements, and surplus. It also gave us patrilineal clans, fortified villages, and the ability to organize mass killings on a scale our hunter-gatherer ancestors could never have imagined. The same innovation that built the first towns also filled the first mass graves. And now, look at you. You carry that scar in your DNA, a reminder of the 19 men who did not make it for every one who did. But you also live in a world they could not have imagined. A world where the skulls at the entrance have been replaced by welcome signs, where the ads has been replaced by the smartphone, where you can go your entire life without ever seeing a weapon raised in anger. The bottleneck is still there in your chromosomes, but so is everything that came after it. Trade, law, diplomacy. The long, slow, imperfect climb toward a world where violence is the exception and not the rule. You are the descendant of the one man who survived, and the civilization he helped build is the reason you will never have to worry about skull cults and shinbone takers. At least for now. If you want more stories about the moments in history when human beings did things that make no sense until you understand their world, subscribe.